So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Carl Garth, and welcome to the Champion Chat with Councillor Alison Champion. Good afternoon, Alison. How are you today?
Oh, Carl, I'm fantastic as always, and thank you for asking and thank you for being here. Great topic today.
That's going to be a ripper topic. Yes, today we are looking at ANZAC Day, the upcoming remembrances, and where does the significance of the day reside in our national and our cultural conscience. Joining Alison for this week's chat, we have former serving members Uncle Charles Pakana, who is the editor of Victorian Aboriginal News, and Glen Ferrarotto, the president of the Montmorency RSL. Welcome, Charles and Glen. How are you both today?
Yeah, all good. Thanks so much for having me along. Looking forward to the yarn.
Yeah, doing really well, Carl. It's a pleasure to be here, mate. Thanks for having us, to yourself and Alison.
Excellent. Well, again, welcome, guys. So whilst there has been some impact in the last few years over recent conflicts and unfortunately some of the controversies surrounding them, the dawn services and ANZAC Day commemoration still hold a really special place in terms of the national mythology around the Aussie digger, Aussie mateship, etc. In recent years, there's been greater recognition of even the often overlooked roles that women, immigrants and Indigenous Australians have played in our wars and in the news and in the arts. And what I'd really like to start with is, for each of you, what are your first memories of ANZAC Day and what did it mean to you? Uncle Charles, could we start with you?
Yeah, sure. I'm 65, so I've seen a fair few ANZAC Days over the years, but I think the first ANZAC Day that is poignant in my mind is in 1976, when I'd been in the army 12 months. My father had died, and I marched with his battalion, the 2nd 33rd Battalion, in ANZAC Day in Sydney, and it was something I never saw my father do. He'd spent pretty much 5 years either fighting the Germans in the North African campaign or the Japanese in the Pacific Islands, and he just never acknowledged ANZAC Day. So I just thought that I would do it this time, and to actually march with those fellas some 31 years after they demobbed in 1945, and to hear stories about my father was a pretty amazing thing for me. But it's also left a number of issues where I also have a different approach now to ANZAC Day than a lot of other people. I still respect it, of course, but it's an overly emotional thing for me. But 1976, that was the first one, marching with Dad's battalion. That was pretty amazing.
And Glen?
Yeah, obviously a fair bit more recent than Uncle Charles's experience, but as with Uncle Charles, my father also served, but as an Italian immigrant, he was conscripted international service during the Vietnam campaign. But Dad didn't make it across to Vietnam. He served his time out in Canberra, and growing up, there was really never any influence of defence or any talk or really any drive from my parents or my family towards ANZAC Day or service in general. Both my grandparents, my grandfathers, I should say, served in World War II. My mum's dad served for the Kiwis, and my dad's dad served with the Italian army. But that said, all the way through, up until the point that I enlisted in 1997, directly after school, I really didn't have any association with ANZAC Day in any capacity other than through education and through schooling. But having enlisted in the army, things changed very quickly, and you almost immediately understand the passion and the history and the honour behind ANZAC Day and what that means to service members and what that means to veterans and their families and the community. So really, 1997 onwards is when I started experiencing Anzac Day, and my journey of Anzac Day has changed immensely over the last 20 years or so.
Okay.
It's yeah, great answers, guys. I'm actually a little bit between the two of you. Like Uncle Charles, my grandfathers served in World War II, and I remember in the 70s as a young boy seeing them ready for Anzac Day. My pop actually did lose an arm in the North African campaign. And my proudest moment after I joined was in 1986, marching with them both up in Bendigo. You know, for that Anzac Day march, it was just something special. And I think, Glenn, the other part that you touched on there was once you're actually part of the Defence Force, and I don't want to say it's a cult of induction, but you really do grasp just how deep into the psyche of the people who serve, that brotherhood, staying together, and especially on Anzac Day, what it means to them. And
absolutely, yeah.
And I still have that sit with me today. You know, we arrange reunions with people we've served with. You don't see them, some of them, for 10, 20 years, but you still have those relationships. So
that's entirely correct, mate.
Yeah. And so we've talked about the fact of our own experiences there, and ours are. It's interesting. Ours have been very recent, or reasonably recent, last 30, 40 years. And originally Anzac Day was from around World War I and then into World War II. With Australians having served in so many different theatres, though, since World War II, do you think that the more recent veterans get the recognition from the public and even maybe support from the government that they probably deserve on Anzac Day?
I'll let Glenn answer this first, because I'll probably take it to an immediate post-Vietnam era and experiences of men with whom I served. But I think Glenn's obviously got a much more recent perspective on this, so I'm going to defer to Glenn on this one initially.
Thanks, Uncle Charles. And so it's a really interesting question. So I can respond to it from a personal perspective and say that for me, even though I have had the privilege of serving our country and in a war-like environment, and during the Afghanistan campaign, and having the honour of being awarded military medals, which is something that is incredibly deeply not emotional, but it's a privilege. It's probably one of the greatest privileges that anyone could have, in my mind, to be honoured with receiving military medals, and then not only having those medals, but pinning them to your chest and then marching on an Anzac Day. It takes your experience of that day to a whole nother level. That said, for me personally, I've never forgotten the reason that we have Anzac Day and what Anzac Day originally meant, and whom it originally honoured, and who it should continue to honour through generations to come. Those being the men in particular who perished during World War I. So from a more contemporary veteran's perspective, and somebody who served in more recent campaigns, I can say that we're honoured to march, and we feel greatly respected and thanked on Anzac Day if we do choose to march, of course. But I don't think we ever forget what Anzac Day is. It's not about us. It's not about our medals. It's about all those men and women who have served, and in particular those men and women who didn't come home. To answer the second part of your question with regards to, do we feel that we receive enough support from government? Look, we could spend all day arguing this point, but I think that we do. I think that the challenge is getting younger men and women into a position where they're comfortable to raise their hand, ask for help, and then guide them to the right areas of government or DBA or other areas to actually get that help. But the help and support and community care is definitely there.
Yeah, I want to agree with Glen as far as I can with my own experiences. As I mentioned prior to us starting this interview, I joined pretty well immediately post-Vietnam in 1975. As a matter of fact, I remember the exact day because it was on my 17th birthday that they actually called me in, and I took the oath and spent the next 9 years there. But this was immediately after Vietnam, or a year or two after Vietnam. So I was incredibly privileged to serve with some amazing men, absolutely amazing men that had been through the horrors of Vietnam. And I was infantry, so these were the men who were truly at the sharp end. We had ex-Special Air Service Regiment soldiers and ex-members of the 5th Battalion and 7th Battalion, because I served with the 5th, 7th at that stage. And some of the stories they told were truly chilling, some of their personal experiences. And I cannot recall one story from one veteran where there wasn't something really dark in their eyes. They were just going off to a place where I just wouldn't want to be. One thing that also held them together was that their memories of being absolutely shunned and spurned by a country that was in such disagreement with the Vietnam War. And I'm not here to comment on the socio-political environment of those days, but the fact is that a lot of your listeners or viewers may recall seeing photographs or footage of diggers marching back after they'd been 12 months in Vietnam and being splattered with red paint or blood, and they had to keep on marching. And that was tough, and I served with some of the men who were actually in that parade. A lot of those men have gone now. The vast majority of those men with whom I've served, I keep hearing that they've died, and I still remember them as such young men. They were older than me. I was 17. They may have been 22, 23, with their infantry combat badge and their Vietnam medals there. But they didn't get enough support. In those days, they simply did not get the support that was needed, especially after a war that was just so unlike any other war, except maybe for those who'd fought in the islands in the Pacific campaign during World War II, where they had constant nightmares. My father, up until his death in 1975, was having nightmares of Japanese snipers in the trees. And these men never, ever got away from that. But from what I've seen, the government is taking a much more responsible approach to its veterans. And we're not just talking about infantry veterans, but veterans of the arms and the corps and the services right across. And there's something that I want to mention here, something that was drilled into me as a young infantry soldier, that, yeah, you may be the guys that have got to go out there and you're being trained to take ground, hold ground, and kill the enemy. But for every single one of you, there's an untold number of support personnel who are keeping you going. They're supplying your food, supplying your ammunition, supplying your clothes. There's so much. And I really want to get across here that anyone who's served in uniform in a time of conflict, whether it's back in Australia or overseas, as far as I'm concerned, those are just as much veterans as anyone else. They haven't been through the horrors of frontline, and I'm thankful that I never have. But an army's more than just a soldier with a rifle, and we've got to always remember that.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Glenn, there's something I'd just like to circle back, if you don't mind. I think it's quite topical in that you were saying, yes, there's support. One of the things we need to do is to get younger veterans to reach out for that support or be aware of that support. Do you think that there's a bit of a stigma or perception be attached to former members seeking help that then inhibits others reaching out for that support?
There certainly has been, in particular, over the first, say, 4 or 5 years post a more steady rotation into Afghanistan. Afghanistan and the Middle East conflict really sort of crept up on us as a nation, and the effects of that war, I think we weren't necessarily that well prepared for, in particular on certain elements of our fighting forces who rotated in and out of that theatre consistently over many, many years. There at the time, and to an extent was still is a stigma, particularly associated with mental health. But it's not a stigma reserved only for Defence Force veterans. It's a systemic national issue that I think as a nation we're getting much better at recognising, and we're certainly much better at wrapping support around people who do raise their hand and say, I have a problem and I need help. The ADF is certainly, as an employer, leading in many aspects with regards to support around mental health, not just for the veteran, but for family members as well. Every new recruit that enlists in the ADF is engaged at the point of enlistment with the Department of Veterans Affairs and offered access to a white card, which provides for them free non-liability mental health care ongoing for the rest of their life after 1 day of service. And so that in itself is a fantastic recognition that times have changed, and that it is okay to put your hand up and ask for help. I think there was a gap though, and we're slowly closing that gap, and that gap existed somewhere between around 2008 to 2015, when we had a number of veterans serve in Afghanistan, leave the Defence Force and kind of just disappear into society. Prior to the ADF and prior to DVA recognising that there was going to be a systemic ongoing issue around mental health for Afghanistan campaign veterans in particular. Organisations like the RSL and other ex-service organisations are doing everything that we can to identify those veterans, find them, and wrap services around them and their families, and we're doing a reasonably good job of that.
And it's it's good to see that happen. I would probably say though that having been on an overseas deployment in the 90s, we were definitely still in the area there of where Uncle Charles was talking about. We weren't shamed like the Vietnam people, but there was definitely a real lack of support services. So whilst I agree with you that those Middle East campaigns snuck up on us, they did actually have the government realise that they did have a bit of a responsibility, and that responsibility retrospectively needed to be applied back many years. So I think they've definitely improved that in the last 10 years from where it was in the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s.
Can I just jump in? I wouldn't mind asking Glenn a question here. It's sort of along the lines. I mean, I remember when I was in, and we were advised that when we went off on leave, when we knocked off work, it was recommended that we change into our civvies. There was still a fair bit of resentment towards us as soldiers. It's different now. I'm quite happy, and I get a really good response from people when I say, look, I served 9 years in the army. Glenn, what's it like nowadays, though? I mean, is the community much more accepting and warm towards the diggers?
Yeah, well raised point, actually. You know, the war on terror, which is what it was referred to, particularly when I was serving and rotating into that campaign around 2007 through 2009. That led to a very much an adverse reaction from the public, or it led to a risk associated with us publicly acknowledging that we served in the Defence Force, and a risk to our families. And the reason being, it was focused on terror and a domestic threat of terror. And so we, living in Sydney at the time, we were advised to not even hang our uniforms on our clothesline, and certainly not to wear uniforms to and from work in any capacity, based simply on the fact that there was a real and significant domestic terrorism threat. And we, as servicemen and women and families of servicemen and women, were at a higher risk of being targeted. So I understand that feeling, Uncle Charles, and many who served in that era did. These days, though, that certainly has pacified, and it's pacified because of the amazing work that our Defence Force and other agencies in particular have done over the last 20 years to reduce that threat domestically. And you know, if you travel to towns like Townsville, for example, large garrison towns, you know, there are uniformed men and women walking proudly around shopping centres and up and down the main streets every day, and it's wonderful to see. And the response and the reaction to our guys and girls wearing uniform by the public is overwhelmingly positive and welcoming. I still get a kick out of seeing you know, young Army reservists, or even more importantly, Army cadets on the train, you know, coming home from their cadet unit or going to their cadet unit. And we can do that now. It's a safer world, and it's a lovely thing to see. So it has gone through periods where we've experienced what you experienced, Uncle Charles, but it's getting much better, and it's a better place for servicemen and women in the country today.
I actually
Alison,
on mental health, if that's okay. I just, as a civilian growing up in a home that has no connection with defence at all, no one in the family. Oh, my grandfather served in World War I in England, but that's it. That's, you know, that's about as far as I've gone with family members in defence. I think about mental health, and I hear that there was a lot of, you know, there would have been a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder after, say, World War I, World War II. We probably didn't call it that. We possibly didn't have a name for it. And we're so conscious of it now. And we have treatments, and we have, you know, you were talking about the white card, we've got some sort of compensation, support. Why do you think that now, and even more so now, we are treating our Defence Force members? We're treating them, we're supporting them. We're doing that now. It's part of being a member of the Defence Force. And yet we didn't have anything like this all those years ago, those decades ago. Do you think it's because we have a lot more knowledge now, not only experience with wartime and participation in war and what happens after, but also just medical knowledge about how humans function, what do you think has been a big contributor to our active support now?
Yeah. I'll just jump in if that's okay on that one. I mean, first of all, there's always been knowledge that war will ravage the mind of a combatant. There's no doubt about that. It's society's approach to that I think has changed, and it's changed incredibly slowly. It's in World War One, men were being shot as cowards because they were suffering this incredible trauma of constant bombardment in the trenches. One can only imagine what hell the men went through on the slopes of Gallipoli, for Christ's sake. I mean, my great uncle, whose name I have, Charles, died as a result of his service there, never made it back to Australia. My father also ended up in 1945 being invalided out because of what was then called war neuroses, and that ultimately took his life in 1975. There was a lot of work being done. After World War One, World War Two, there were repatriation services and repatriation hospitals. But the medical professionals had no flaming idea, really, about how to deal with this. They simply didn't understand the impact that it must have on someone when they're constantly being shot at, or not even being shot at, but at the risk of being shot at. I mean, I can only imagine, and Glen can comment on this, but there must be a degree of trauma in being rotated out of Australia from the life in a barracks out to a field of conflict, and knowing, Jesus, am I ever going to come back again? But there has been a lot of work done. There's a lot of care that I've seen. And the government's also done a hell of a lot. And I'm going to put my hand up for the government here. I mean, in 1975, when my father died, my mother ended up with a gold card. That is a war widow's pension card. And that was recognition of the service that my father had endured from 1940 to 1945. And it was recognition there, I think, from the government, because I got to say, as soon as Mum got that gold card, I made sure she used the flaming thing to the best of her ability, because that's what my dad wanted. And as far as I'm concerned, she deserved it from that. But I also want to stick my hand up for organisations like Legacy. These other organisations, I remember within a week of Dad dying, Legacy was out there sitting down with Mum, going over his discharge certificate and offering any assistance they could for her. So it's not just the government. It is, as Glen said, it's the RSL. RSL does amazing work and have for goodness knows how long. So does Legacy. Salvation Army also. All these support orgs. I just think we need to remember these people as well in contributing.
Entirely correct.
Yeah. I think Alison, Uncle Charles has definitely hit the nail on the head there. The other part of that is initially it was always seen as a soldier's problem. They use terms like shell shock, battle fatigue, etc. It's only been over the last 30 to 40 years that doctors have realised that stress can take so many different forms, hence the term post-traumatic stress. And so that's when they really started to invest in, what are the causes, but what are the ongoing problems and struggles that people who have gone through that have to deal with. And the realisation is that the numbers in society are a lot greater than what they probably ever thought. And I mean, you only need to look at 2 years' worth of COVID and the fact that of lockdowns in Melbourne. And in Melbourne right now, you're on a 6-month waiting list to see a psychiatrist. That alone tells you how many people in normal society can suffer for a whole range of different things. The support is definitely out there now, and it is still evolving. And it's moved away from now being seen as purely something for military personnel. And I think that's a good thing because in the end, Uncle Charles said it, you're a soldier, you're taught to kill, you're taught to sometimes do the most heinous things that you can do to another person. But then you've got to integrate back into society.
Which doesn't function that way at all. And family. And then obviously that extends to your family who are living with you and experiencing your post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
Glenn,
is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Oh, it's been well covered, but I think touching on family, if I can, and Alison, I'm glad you raised the point, to acknowledge the work that I guess the government, any government, has been focusing on over the years now. We being the veteran community now not only have a repatriation commissioner, and the role of the repatriation commissioner is as it was when it was first put in place post World War I to protect the entitlements of ADF veterans. We now also have a family advocate commissioner in Gwen Ferrarotto, who sits alongside the current repatriation commissioner in Don Spinks. Mm-hmm. And the family advocate commissioner is responsible for the care of ADF veteran families, partners, children, and alike. And so there is a huge amount of awareness of the effect of service effect that service has on families across a whole range of influencing factors, such as employment, for example, such as domestic violence in some cases, and there's a very keen focus on ensuring that we're putting as much wraparound services in place for families as there are for those men and women who serve, which is incredibly important to acknowledge.
And these positions, these government positions, are they reasonably very recent?
The repatriation commissioner is not. That position has been in place since around 1918. However, the family commissioner is a more recent appointment, but it's certainly an enduring appointment. There are, in fact, many ex-service organisations that are established just to support families as well, such as Legacy, of course, as the preeminent ESO that supports families. But there are a number of others that have been stood up in recent times that perhaps offer different services to Legacy. Just to close out on this point, and to add to a comment Uncle Charles made about Legacy, to this day they continue to provide the most outstanding service to our to partners and families of our veterans, and in a terrible, tragic circumstance that occurred around, in fact, 2 years ago. My closest mate passed away through cancer. We enlisted in the army together. He left behind his, at the time, 2-year-old boy and 4-year-old daughter, that local family, Eltham-based, and Kath, his wife. Within 2 days of Paul's death, Legacy was on the front door and sitting down and working with Kath, and have been engaged with Kath and the kids ever since. They're attending camps, they're attending networking and social activities. There's wraparound services available to the entire family through Legacy. So they are as strong and committed to supporting not just widows, but families and children of veterans as they ever have been. And they're a wonderful organisation, that is Legacy.
Wow, that is fantastic.
Yeah. Glenn, actually, look, I just before we close that part off, because that's been inspiring to hear that story. Do you think that maybe not so much that there's more that could be done do you think maybe there needs to be more education in what is available and how to access it?
I think awareness is a critical measure. So awareness/education. One of the issues that we faced as ADF veterans and families is this sheer amount of support that's available. It can be overwhelming, and trying to understand which particular organisation you should go to for a particular issue can be difficult. There are organisations and online platforms that are available to veterans. One of those platforms is a platform called Serve You Link, which is an online tool that allows veterans to go in and navigate their way to certain services, and they've consolidated services from a national perspective. It's been funded in some way through the RSL. But awareness is a critical issue that we are working on. Right now, we're in the middle of a Royal Commission into defence and veteran suicide.
Yes.
That commission has been underway now for over 12 months, and simply through the outcomes of that commission, there will be greater awareness created, and I think it's tragic that we had to put a Royal Commission in place to better prevent the unruly higher rates of suicide and suicidality that are experienced in the veteran community. But we must remember that that suicide and suicidality have been an issue since men and women have returned from conflicts, from the Boer War through to modern day conflict. It's not a new issue. It's been occurring. It just hasn't been recognised or spoken about until more recently. So the Royal Commission will certainly shine a spotlight on services and shine a spotlight on issues that lead to those higher rates of suicide and suicidality. But again, as I said, it's tragic that we had to get to that point, but at least we're doing something about it.
Glenn, you mentioned a link a moment ago. Could we have that link so that we can put it in the copy for people who watch this podcast might be able to go there and find out where they can get assistance?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I can very easily share that with you, Carl, if you like, post the discussion.
That'd be great. Thank you. Look, I'd like to bring us back to ANZAC Day. I think over the last 30 years, I think we've really seen the popularity of ANZAC Day actually really take off through the incorporating or the collaboration with major sporting events in Australia. And that's, with the AFL, especially in the AFL and the NRL. And it's something you see a lot of in the United States and Great Britain as well, other nations where they're getting this tie-in. What are your thoughts about the fact that it's happened, and do you see it as a success? Do you see it as something that's helping to bring new generations awareness of ANZAC Day?
I don't know if it brings an awareness to ANZAC Day. I mean, I really, I think about, okay, it's a Collingwood and Essendon game on ANZAC Day here in Victoria, and as long as Collingwood wins, I'm a pretty happy fella. I've got to say that. But look, for me, I've got a number of daughters, and even though I find ANZAC Day far too emotional to be involved in now, I don't watch it on TV. It's just personally too much. But I would take my children to the dawn service. So you've got to get up in the dark, because that's the least you can do to honour your grandfather, who's not here because of his service. And it helped me explain why they don't have a granddad. None of my kids met their grandfather. And that was, for me, that was personally a really important thing. Anzac Day services when I was in the army. They were interesting because they were with my mates, and it was a mix of peacetime soldiers like myself and as I've mentioned before, Vietnam veterans. I think, look, I'm in two minds about whether Anzac Day should be used as a platform to promote sport, or if sport can be used as an excuse to say, well, you know, we're promoting Anzac Day. I just don't know. I mean, Anzac Day for me is that dawn service, and it will always be that dawn service. Yeah, I really can't comment on that one. I can't. I'll offend someone if I do one way or the other. But for me, emotional, it stands on its own. Do we really need to see a sporting fixture to remember those men and women who've sacrificed their lives and their families?
Glenn?
I'm an Essendon supporter. And
oh, this couldn't have worked out any better, could it?
Oh, buddy.
Very good.
So in actual fact, the Anzac Day game has been a horrible experience for me for a number of years. But jokes aside, so look, I do have an opinion on this, and without wanting to offend anyone, I actually am an advocate. I'm an advocate for it. I guess I would explain that in saying that I have had the honour or privilege of standing on the ground during the minute silence on Anzac Day. It was just prior to. So it would have been around 2019, I guess, or 2018. But and to stand in a packed MCG, 80,000 people plus, if not closer to 100, I guess, and to be in an environment where you could literally hear a coin fall to the ground is incredible. And that moment, if that's the only moment in time and over a 12-month period that 100,000 people come together to pause for a minute and reflect on the sacrifice and service of our Anzacs, then I say let's keep doing it. It's not just AFL that deliver services and play an Anzac Day game, for example. NRL are now doing it, and they do it very well. Even our basketball league is conducting Anzac Day games and Remembrance Day games as well. From a local perspective, as an RSL sub-branch president, myself and our committee are engaged by all the local football clubs in our area around Anzac Day, and each of the local football clubs, from juniors right through to seniors, conduct an Anzac Day service the week prior to, if possible, Anzac Day. And so seeing that level of community involvement, focused not just on sport, but allowing sport to be the platform to pause and reflect on sacrifice and service, I think is wonderful. It's in our psyche as Australians. We love sport, and I think I'd like to see that continue. So I'm certainly an advocate for it.
Thank you both, and it's good to have the opinions and hear what makes it special for each person. When I do look at it, I can see, I believe it has had an impact, rightly or wrongly. I remember in the 80s and early 90s being at the shrine, and there weren't very many young children there. The dawn service. I haven't been to the shrine since COVID for Anzac Day, but I remember just prior to COVID, and you would go to the shrine and there would be thousands of young children there for the dawn service, which Uncle Charles, as you say, you take your daughters to the dawn service, and for you, there was always that military tie-in and that family tie-in, etc. Whereas not everybody I see or saw at the shrine at those times looked as though they'd come with a military background. I know that might sound like I'm probably generalising there, but I do feel that awareness through one part has brought support and engagement into the other, definitely what I would say more poignant parts. My brother, who also served, went to Gallipoli one year for the dawn service, and it has become it's almost a pilgrimage for young Australians. But when they're travelling overseas now, if they can, to try to get to Gallipoli, and they have to park or take a bus, and they still have to then walk kilometres because there's just such a sea of humanity. At a place that's not even Australian, but the significance for Australians is, I don't like to use the term sacred, but it would be very close to. So I think anything that we can use to increase the awareness and the engagement is great, but I also agree with you too, let's not lose sight of the true respect and of the real ceremonies.
Yep.
And you know what? I'm one of those people who didn't have a lot in my childhood about ANZAC Day or contribute to ANZAC Day or participate in ANZAC Day. I think I remember my mum one day saying, "Oh, darling, before you go to school today, you need to put on a bit of rosemary." When we had a rosemary bush in our garden, it was like, just need to put some rosemary on before you go to school today for ANZAC Day.
Yep.
That was it. That was it. And there would have been something at school. We learned a little bit of something at school. There would have been an activity, but there wasn't necessarily an excursion anywhere. My family didn't take me anywhere on the day. It was another public holiday. And being in Sydney, we didn't have a sport match. It was just another public holiday in the 70s. Whereas now, it's the best. It's just a great day. And, brought the boys along. My sons are now 16 and 19. They've been coming to the dawn service on ANZAC Day. So I think I'd have to say I agree. There is a lot more awareness and a want to be aware and a want to be involved on this day.
One thing that actually really gladdened my heart during lockdown was, there was the initiative to be out in your driveway for the dawn service and have it playing over your phone so that you could hear the dawn service. And I remember up and down our street, there were people we were out there with our candles and our own little dawn service, and you acknowledge the person across the road, even though you couldn't go there, but we were there celebrating, commemorating, probably. Sorry, not celebrating.
It's a really good point, Carl. Sorry, Uncle Charles, you go ahead.
Well, I'll be very, very quick, Glenn. Don't chastise yourself for saying the word celebration, because it is a celebration also of, or it can be considered a bit of a celebration of a part of this country's modern history. And I'll say modern because that's obviously the Aboriginal in me coming out on this one. But we do need to celebrate. This is part of our identity, the commemoration and the celebrations. I just wanted to pick you up on that. It's an okay little trip up to say that word, mate. So, Glenn, back to you, buddy.
I totally agree with that. I'm glad you clarified that for Carl, Uncle Charles, because I absolutely agree with you. You mentioned the lockdowns, and one of the most solemn experiences I've had on an ANZAC Day has in fact been right in the middle of the lockdowns. It must have been 2021, I would imagine, but we were not allowed out of our house. However, we'd made a decision as an RSL, and I was honoured to take on the responsibility to conduct a dawn service at the Eltham Cenotaph, and I did it absolutely on my own. I set up a small piece of music, if you like. So I had the last post, and I had the Australian and New Zealand anthems ready to play on my phone through Spotify. I conducted the service, very quick service, but with full respect to the men in particular on our cenotaph, and I read all of their names out, and then I drove home, and drove home in darkness, and there was no one on the road. It was an incredibly solemn yet privileged experience, and I just thought I'd mention that. But it's quite a special thing. And I'm sure I wasn't the only person around the country who attended a cenotaph on that day during lockdowns, and we were quite ready to argue the point if we were pulled up for being there.
Good on you, mate. Good on you.
Yeah.
Very well done. And that's speaks volumes for the responsibility and respect that you feel, Glenn. So,
thanks, mate. But again, certainly wouldn't have been the only person at a cenotaph on that day. And but yeah, it just needed to be done, and I'm glad that we did it.
We're coming towards the end. Probably one thing I would like to finally finish with is if you'd be able to share with us, all three of you, what you will be doing this ANZAC Day, what ceremonies or activities your various organisations will be hosting. And for everybody watching this, we will be putting in the text of this podcast the various websites that you can visit and the times and dates of some of these activities if you do wish to attend.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to go first, please. Alison, as our local
That's so polite. All right, so for me, my regular ANZAC Day activities, they actually started in 2015 when we celebrated 100 years, and that was my first dawn service in Eltham. And I attend every year the dawn service in Eltham. So obviously more recently as a neighbouring councillor to the Eltham community. So I'm there certainly by midday. Sorry, not midday, 6, easily 6. We're supposed to be there about 5:30, and we congregate. And I'm there for that time. And then I go to the Eltham, the Monty Eltham March, which actually starts in Weir Street, at the top of Weir Street. We congregate there. When I say we, I mean not only those who served from our community, but also our scout clubs join us as well, and there are the dignitaries in the area. And we march from the top of Weir Street, left along Rattray, left to Mountain View, and then right down the driveway to the cenotaph there in the Monty Eltham RSL. And there is just a sea of people. It is so beautiful to see. And this is a time that you go, yes, there are so many people in the community of all different ages that participate. So we have a lot of school children come, primary children, and we have some high school children as well, and the community just joins the service. So it's a very family orientated morning. So that's around the sort of the 9:30 mark, as well as the dignitaries also join us as well. So that's my morning. And then if there's anything there isn't anything in the afternoon usually. It's sort of people tend to go to the football. I don't participate in that, but there's often there can be something else to do on the day. So that's my ANZAC Day now as a councillor.
Uncle Charles?
Yeah, I've been thinking, gee, what sort of answer do you want to hear? I suppose I can only give you the truth. So look, I may go to a dawn service. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's very emotional for me. I always spare time and think about my dad, because to lose him at 17, barely 3 months after I joined the army, was just, a catastrophic thing for me in my life. I'll probably yarn with my kids. That's what I did last year. I set up a Zoom and we talked about my father. It's really important. And we talked a bit about, the sacrifice of other men and women who are no longer with us. That's what I'll do. For me, it's a very personal thing. Yeah, that's it. Nothing grand from this perspective.
Mm.
And
Yeah, look, Anzac Day for an RSL sub-branch president gets pretty hectic. And in fact, we start planning months in advance. So we quite literally get through Remembrance Day and we start to put plans in place for Anzac Day. We'll conduct our dawn service, which is incredibly well supported by our local Rotary at 6 a.m. in Eltham, outside the Cenotaph, and that dawn service can attract upwards of 7,000 people. It is one of the largest dawn services in the outer suburbs of, in fact, certainly the largest dawn service in the outer suburbs of Melbourne. From there, we'll have a breakfast of some description. The Rotary guys will always cook a sausage sizzle, and the Eltham Footy Club is opening their doors this year as well for bacon and egg sandwiches and the like, a little further down below the Cenotaph. The 10:30 service, as Alison has alluded to, which is held post the march at Montmorency. So we kick the march off at around, I guess we'll congregate around 9:30, and we'll march from Weir Street down to the RSL, and that march is incredibly well attended year on year. We have a large contingent of local CFA and our MFB firefighters marching with us this year as well, Alison, which will be wonderful. As you say, scout groups and a lot of other community groups get involved in the band, etc. So we'll get down to the RSL, and that service at 10:30 at the RSL is very much, as Alison has said, a community and family orientated service. Whilst we certainly don't move away from the solemnness and the ceremony of an Anzac Day service, we allow the children to deliver it, and it's well regarded and well recognised. Uncle Charles, the children will always give a acknowledgement of country prior to that service, which we have instigated in the last 2 years, which we will continue to do, and we will include every Remembrance Day as well, acknowledgement of country, if not a welcome by a local elder, and a smoking ceremony prior to our Remembrance Day services year on year as well at the Montmorency Eltham RSL. We will take a leading role in reconciliation around our community, and we feel that is one way in which we can do that and acknowledge the service and sacrifice of our Indigenous men and women as well through generations. So thank you, Uncle Charles, and from our services, we'll move into the RSL and we'll conduct our normal Anzac Day activities, which include two-up and just a good opportunity for veterans, families, and community members to come together and pay tribute to our fallen.
Excellent.
I might just pop a little additional comment in there with Glen having taken over the presidency of the Monty Eltham RSL, very conscious that he wants to bring a greater understanding to community about what it is to be a member of the RSL, a Defence Force representative, everything that goes with those activities, so that the community understands that an RSL is part of their home, it's another place to be at, visit, learn from, contribute to. And it's not a place that is only for veterans. It is actually for everybody in the community. And it would be brilliant if the space becomes, or the building and the area becomes, a welcoming place. It's to be a welcoming place for everybody, as a safe place to be, to join, and to learn from. So I know that that's a really significant part of Glen's presidency, and I'd like to certainly support that. I know Banyule supports that, and we would love to do that too, and make sure everyone understands what it is for our Defence Forces to be as community members.
Thanks, Alison. Entirely right, and we're working very hard towards that outcome.
Mm.
Well, I think we might wrap it up there. I'd love to thank everybody for their time today. Alison and Uncle Charles and Glen, thank you for your time, and more importantly, thank you for your service.
Mm.
And thank you to everybody for listening to this podcast. I hope that you're all able to find a way to join in ANZAC Day commemorations, celebrations and ceremonies this ANZAC Day. If you can check the text below, you will see links to these various activities and timetables in the Banyule Malcolm area. And I'd love to invite you all to join us next month for another episode of the Champion Chat. Thank you all, and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.